All right, hey guys. Today we're going to be looking at carbohydrate, specifically the macronutrient in sport and exercising populations and its supplementation. So it should be pretty fun. I think most of us like carbohydrates here. Hopefully, we don't offend too many carnivore people. So there's a few things to know about carbohydrates kicking the ball off here. There's going to be different types of carbohydrates, and they essentially have different use cases. So there's simple carbohydrates, which are either one or two monosaccharides chained together. And the benefit of these types of carbohydrates is they tend to be very fast digesting, which, as we'll see a little bit later, has some unique use cases. There's also complex carbohydrates, which is where you typically think when people describe healthy food. And this is three or more monosaccharides chained together, and these tend to be slower digesting. Fiber is an example of one of these, though there's little to no digestion that occurs with fiber. Some relevant pieces of content surrounding these types of carbohydrates, first being something you may have heard called the glycemic index. This is essentially how quickly a food affects your blood sugar per 50 grams of carbohydrate ingested. So, for instance, a 50 grams of carbs worth of Pop-Tarts is likely going to drastically increase blood sugar much more quickly than something that is a much slower type of carb. Maybe vegetables are involved or fats also involved with the food. Simple carbs, again, tend to be higher on this glycemic index. Glycemic load takes into account another variable, which is the glycemic index plus the amount of carbs that a food has. So glycemic index just measures it per 50 grams, but in terms of how diets actually work, total carbohydrate ingestion also matters. So, for instance, a Mountain Dew has like 45 grams of carbohydrates. So let's say we took in two Mountain Dews, roughly 90 grams of carbs. That is a ton of carbohydrates that is very quickly going to get into the bloodstream and affect your blood sugar. So it's going to have a high glycemic load. Inversely, if you have like a big meal that tends to have like higher fats, more complex carbs, less total in the total meal versus the calories that you get, it's going to have a little bit of a lower glycemic load because it takes time for those carbs to get into the bloodstream, and also there's less of them there per amount of food. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but now we're going to kind of expand with how carbohydrates actually work. So ultimately, all carbs are going to get digested and, for the most part, converted into glucose. Glucose is a usable form of sugar that's within our bloodstream, and then it also can get stored in the muscles, which we'll talk about here in a sec. So one of the three options that you can do with glucose is make it for fuel or use it for fuel. So if in athletic performance, or just I'm probably using a little bit of glucose right now. If I were to take the stairs, I'd probably use a little bit of glucose. Next would be muscle glycogen or glycogen stored in the liver. So those are two options that you have. Muscle glycogen tends to be the largest storage that you have. And that's good because you're most readily going to need that energy available for sport and energy metabolism for exercise. And then lastly, if you have an excess of it, it can be converted to fatty acids and stored as adipose. This is where some people kind of miss the ball. They think that because fats say fat in the title, essentially, if you are burning fat, therefore you are burning belly fat. And that's not always the case. Total caloric balance dictates whether you burn belly fat or dietary fat intake. The inverse or the same is also true with carbohydrate. If you take in too many carbohydrate, your body actually has to store those in some capacity, and they'll be converted into fatty acids and stored as body fat. So carbs, just like fat, just like protein, taken in with too many calories total, will add to fat stores. So what's going to exactly occur when your body decides you either need to store or use carbohydrates? A hormone called insulin is going to get released when you need to store it. This is going to take glucose from your bloodstream essentially and store it into tissue, whether that be muscle, liver, adipose. There's a lot of storage place for it. Glucagon is going to be the opposite. So we have all this stored energy over here, but it's not exactly the most usable. Glucagon takes that stored energy and essentially mobilizes the troops, that energy, for usage. So you can actually climb that flight of stairs, run away from that bear, take your jog to Starbucks, whatever it may be. So There's a few limiting factors in exercise relevant to all exercise performance, but we're going to typically hone in on the third one. So the first one is the muscle, through damage or some other means like central nervous system, can't output requisite force. Second, being the high ATP demand of exercise prevents the full oxidation of glucose, meaning you're starting to move into anaerobic glycolysis, which is going to start lactate accumulation. Lactate, remember, is not the bad guy here. Lactate can actually be used as a secondary form of energy. What ends up being the bad guy in this scenario is when you're producing lactate, you're actually, because of that chemical reaction, giving off hydrogen ions. And it's these hydrogen ions that are floating around here that make the blood more acidic, and that's what actually burns. It's called muscle acidosis. And then third, where we come in, is the energy reserves of the muscle deplete. So you run out of muscle glycogen and glucose, and muscle performance is going to drop off. This is primarily why pre, during, and post-exercise nutrition, and specifically carbohydrates, is crucial if you want to be the best athlete that you can be. Again, don't kill me, carnivore people. So looking at a few carbohydrate recommendations. First, let's just kind of knock this out of the way. Fiber, 30 to 35 grams for men, 25 to 32 grams for women. Fiber is very, very beneficial. One of the most beneficial things you can do nutritionally for your health. And it's also super awesome for satiety. So if you're having a hard time dropping your body fat a little bit and you're eating in a caloric deficit, increasing your fiber intake can sometimes help you stay nice and full. So moving into carb recommendations, for general exercise, we're thinking about 3 to 5 grams per kilogram per day. Moving into some more moderate to high intensity exercise, so if you're completing 10 to 18 hours a week of moderate intensity or higher, we're thinking more like that 5 to 8 grams per kilogram per day option. And then for high intensity, whether you're doing 2 a days or 18 plus hours a week, we're thinking 8 to 10 grams per kilogram. And again, this is to ensure that you can both recover and perform. So some of the sources that you want to get these carbohydrates from, a majority of your carbs should likely come from the following, being whole grains, vegetables, and fruits. This is just because they're chock full of other micronutrients, things that are good for overall health, and also it provides a little bit of a slower drip of energy into the system. Conversely, quicker gastric emptying foods such as sugar, starches, and energy drinks, but also sports drinks, these should be reserved for when you need glycogen now. So these make really awesome options for intra-workout fuel if you need to bring that blood sugar up immediately. But again, the majority should come from those slower digesting to provide that steady drip of energy throughout your life and throughout energy. And then we need a little top up in the immediate battle of sport competition, Gatorade, gummy bears, things like that. Like, get the carbohydrates in your system, get them in the bloodstream quickly. Some special considerations to think about. Carbohydrates specifically take precedence over other foods, meaning vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats, anything in these specific instances. If your carbohydrate need is high, meaning more than 8 grams per kilogram per day, you should be centering your thinking around ensuring that you're getting spaced out adequate carbohydrate intake. Secondarily, you are within about 4 hours post-exercise. The anabolic window is largely a myth, but that is an awesome time to start shuttling glycogen into the muscle and increasing protein synthesis. So if you're eating carbohydrates within that 4 hours of post-training or exercise, you're likely going to get a little bit of benefit out of it. Where that anabolic window starts to be a myth is when people thought you need to take in protein and carbs 10 minutes after training or something. It likely doesn't need to be that fast. Pre and post-workout nutrition should likely focus on carbohydrates and protein intake while limiting fat intake. And there's a few reasons for this. This is going to help optimize muscle protein synthesis and glycogen repletion. So we're actually laying down skeletal muscle because muscle protein synthesis, and we're getting glycogen stored in that muscle, so we're good to go for next time. Think optimal recovery. And it does this very rapidly, and it gets us to a recovered state more quickly. The problems with fat is it kind of muddies the water, slows digestion, and reduces those spikes of glycogen repletion and muscle protein synthesis. So pre, intra, and post-workout, specifically pre and post in this instance, focus on high protein, high carbohydrate meals. Some other special considerations are going to be timing. So if you're exercising for more than 2 to 3 hours, you're likely going to want to ingest about 0.7 grams per kilogram per hour in a 6 to 8% solution. So what that means is if you were taking in 100 milliliters of water, you would likely want to have 0.7 grams of carbohydrate in that solution. This is to ensure that you're getting in the carbohydrates and not diluting it too much, but also staying hydrated. Strength athletes may also benefit from higher carbohydrate intakes, and this is both true pre and post workout. So the recommendations are somewhat similar, but strength and hypertrophy athletes may also benefit from higher protein intakes. See the previous lecture on that one. An intra-workout intake for strength athletes could likely focus on these similar types of strategies, and it could also be even more refined carbohydrates. So whereas a endurance athlete might need to take it in with water to make sure it's ultra hydrated, strength and hypertrophy exercisees may have an option where they're eating. You see some things like candy in the powerlifting, weightlifting circles. That's an option. They can also get it in as a shake, but they have a little bit more freedom because the fact that they basically sit there in between sets. So a few things to conclude on and kind of the take-home message. Number one factor in your performance is going to be adequate carbohydrate intake. If you're not getting adequate carbohydrate intake, you're probably not performing at your best. In long duration activity and training, the need for pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout carbohydrates drastically increases. This is also the same strategy that can be used for strength and hypertrophy workout. So just know if you're running 2 hours or if you're strength training for 2 hours, carbohydrates pre and post and intra help you out as well. And if you're not getting adequate intake and or timing, what you can expect is your performance to suffer, your recovery to suffer, your muscle gains to suffer, and you to make a lot of sad faces because you're not as jacked as you could be, you're not as recovered as you could be, and you're not taking first place as often as you could. Hopefully that helps. Again, I don't think any of us are going to have a hard time wanting to intake more carbohydrates. They are delicious. So hopefully this kind of helps you center how much carbohydrates you need to be taking in based off the sport that you're doing. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and I hope this helps.